Hello and welcome to the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies. I'm Ken Bamberger, professor at the law school and co-faculty director. You're joining us today for a conversation with Professor Yofi Tirosh about her work on issues of sex segregation in Israeli society and the appropriate balance between religious accommodation and sex equality. Professor Michael Helfand will be moderating. Our discussion today is part of a year-long virtual lunchtime series on civil society and plurality in Israel. And it's showcasing recent scholarly work about critical social and political issues and movements in Israeli society today. Earlier this year, we heard Hebrew University law professor Michael Kiryani about his new book, A Multicultural Entrapment, on religion and state among the Palestinian Arabs in Israel. And then Tel Aviv University political scientist Professor Amal Jamal on his new book, Reconstructing the Civic, Palestinian Civic Activism in Israel. And if you missed these two sessions, you can find the recordings on our website, along with information about other upcoming talks. Today, we're honored to be joined by Professor Yofi Tirosh, professor at Tel Aviv University's Buchmann Faculty of Law and the former dean of the Sapir Academic College School of Law in the Negev, and a Michigan alum. Her work on anti-discrimination law and civil rights has won numerous awards and significant funding from Israel's NSF. And in addition to her most recent research on the effects and legality of sex segregation, which we'll hear about today, Professor Tirosh has produced significant scholarship on the ways in which the body and physical appearance are understood and regulated and constructed by the law. And we're so pleased to welcome as today's discussant, friend of the Diller Institute, Professor Michael Helfand. Professor Helfand is Vice Dean and Professor at Pepperdine University's Caruso Law School, where he also directs the Notebar Institute for Law, Religion, and Ethics. He's one of America's leading scholars of law and religion, among other things in thinking about how secular and religious systems can coexist under the same law. We're so happy to have you both here virtually and look forward to a time soon when we can more easily host you once again in person. I note for our attendees that in the latter part of the discussion, they'll draw on questions in the Q&A box, so please feel free, starting now, to submit your questions there. And please welcome Yofi and Michael.
Yofi, so great to be here with you today. I know it's a bit late in Israel, so thanks for hanging with us.
Yeah, I'll try to do my best. It's way past my bedtime as an early bird, but the discussion will be so invigorating that I'll stay up, I'm sure. Thanks.
I'll try to make sure I ask questions to keep you on your toes. Maybe to get us started, how did you get interested in this topic?
Well, I guess I was always interested in gender equality issues, but in Israel, the sense was growing up that we're pretty good at that. You know, it's the country that gave women the vote from its inception, and even before that, we had one of the first female prime ministers in the modern era, Golda Meir, of course. There is an amazing line of legislation which is very progressive, and also case law on those issues. So when I went to do my graduate degree at the University of Michigan Law School, I thought I would come back to Israel and deal with feminist issues, but they won't be kind of the feminist 101. They'll be feminist for advanced questions. And then I encountered about 10 years ago this phenomenon that really blew my mind. And the phenomenon was that rather than dealing with, you know, stereotypes, unconscious bias, organizational structures that are non-egalitarian for women, I encountered first generation discrimination. So laws or institutional patterns that suggest that by the power of being a woman, by the mere fact that you are a woman, you should stand aside or cover yourself, or a different law should apply to you. And that's when I got interested in what we know today to call questions of women's exclusion or sex segregation.
You mentioned that you started seeing this around 10 years ago. Paint a picture for us as to what things looked like before those 10 years. Kind of how did issues around questions of sex segregation and questions of religion in Israel, how did those play out kind of before this more recent trend?
So we have a country that thinks of itself in its constitutional documents as Jewish and democratic, and we all know it's a very delicate and ongoing game of balance. But we pretty much had this balance where the ultra-Orthodox, which are about 10 or 15% of the Israeli society, accepted these kind of concessions from the early state. Ben-Gurion in the early 40s wrote a famous letter called the Status Quo Letter, in which it drew major principles on how state and religion will go together. So it had there things like personal status laws, marriage, divorce will be under each citizen's religion. The country will keep the Shabbat, public places will keep kosher food. And also one of the agreements was that in order to kind of reignite the civilization of Jewish genius, Jewish study of Jewish philosophy and law, there will be an exception from the universal draft to the military in Israel, given to a few hundred prodigies in Jewish law that will be able to spend all of their time in a yeshiva and be funded by the country and not go to the military. Now, as things go in Israel and elsewhere, this little exception became the norm for ultra-Orthodox men. The convention in the ultra-Orthodox community has been that men spend their time in the yeshiva. This is the aspiration of every young woman to be matched to a kind of a scholar that is considered brilliant in Jewish law. An average Haredi family lives on a woman's salary, which is typically low in unskilled and low status jobs, although there has been a change in recent years. It has 7 children on average. It gets a lot of other sources of income like state support, welfare, and contributions, donations from within the community and from abroad. But the thing was that until about 10 years ago, the Haredi community, the Orthodox community, lived a very secluded life by choice. As a matter of principle, there was a symbolic and often a physical wall between Haredi cities and neighborhoods and the general society in order to keep the cohesive culture, which tends to be very kind of supervising each aspect of a person's life from the minute they wake up in the morning to when they sleep at night. And then the contact between the ultra-Orthodox society and the general society was pretty minimal. Things started to change about 10 years ago in 2 respects. One was the introduction of smartphones to our lives, which is something that just, happened. Nobody can control it. The fact that there is a taboo against computers and internet at Haredi homes meant that this was a chance to use the little computer that we have on our palm as an exit point to learn about the general society. What we know today is that more than half of the Haredi population, despite the objection of their leadership, the spiritual leadership, owns two phones. One is a smartphone in which they surf the web and read non-Haredi newspapers and often are on Twitter or Facebook. And they kind of open up to how the other side lives. You know, they grow up with those messages that secular people, all they care about are parties and drugs. And all of a sudden they realize that there is a culture, content, ethics, you know, that the general world, both in Israel and outside of it, has something to offer. So the fences kind of drop. And the other phone that they have is a kosher phone, which is kind of a simple Nokia where you can only talk, you can't even text in. The smartphone is held often secretly because it's kind of forbidden. If the teachers in your child's school knew that you have a smartphone, the school will not admit your child if it's a prestigious school. So what the smartphone technology brought in is an interest in kind of pursuing professions, joining the consumer culture, doing things that, you know, general modern people do. The other thing that happened is that Israel joined the OECD, the Organization of Developed Countries. And when you join the OECD, you have to start reporting on all kinds of factors in your country. What those reportings indicated was that there are huge economic gaps in Israel. It only lags behind the US, and this is kind of oppose the ethos of Israel as a welfare state, as a state with a, you know, thick social network. And what was evident from those reports was that the two groups that most contribute to this socioeconomic gap are Arab women and ultra-Orthodox men. Both of them do not participate enough in the labor market. So the government started initiating all kinds of programs to encourage Haredi men to join the labor market, which is accompanied by a lot of ambivalence. It's not easy for Haredi men to kind of leave the full-time yeshiva study and go and pursue a occupation and work. And it's not easy for two main reasons. One is that they are expected to be, by the modern conventions, this is not how it used to be in the religious world always, but by modern conventions, they're expected to spend full-time studying. So when they don't do that, they often are ostracized or are sanctioned in many ways. And the other reason why it's hard is that, as we started our conversation, in the Israeli society, men and women function alongside one another everywhere, in every classroom, in every office, in the mall, in the town square. And in the life of a Haredi man, this is a real hurdle because you grow up with the code of conduct, which sets a huge taboo on every unnecessary interaction with the opposite sex, except if it's your mother or your daughter or a first line of family contact. And so this is the big dilemma that we're facing. How do we expect Haredi men to integrate into the general society, to go study in a university, to work in a governmental office, and start functioning on a routine basis alongside women, when until the age of 22 or 23, their only contact with women was with downcast eyes in the third person plural, never, giving the keys directly from hand to hand, but putting them on the table, having some distance between them. And the way that the Israeli government has been approaching this difficult challenge has been, in my mind, through too easy a fix. And the fix is, okay, we have a problem. Let's distinguish between men and women. Let's not only concede to requirements of introducing segregated spaces, but initiate and subsidize and encourage spaces that are segregated between men and women. And that, in my mind, is a major reason for concern and consideration. This is our most urgent homework in terms of sex equality in Israel today.
Yofi, you mentioned a little bit about kind of, giving a picture of the government's dilemma in these circumstances, and then kind of started on why you think they've traveled down the wrong road. Could you paint a little more of a picture as to kind of the dilemma? So kind of the economic gaps that, through kind of, as you described, that the government had identified, what were the consequences of those economic gaps between certain segments of the Israeli population and the rest of the population? Why? I'm trying to get at, why is the government so concerned about this? Why is it going through to these lengths to engage in what you see as these, missteps? But what's the motivation behind it? What are they worried about?
So one thing is purely economical in terms of macroeconomics. It's about under contribution to the GDP. It's about all kinds of other measures of growth and financial prosperity of the country, and the contribution to the gaps, as I said before. Another really significant trope in the Israeli discourse, which also has put in power several times one of Israel's largest parties today, Yesh Atid, was the trope of equal burden. So why do we, the seculars and the national religious, the Zionist religious, risk life and limb and give our best years to the military, whereas the Haredim are waived off of that? And I think these are the two main things. There are other issues, but I think the thing that is most important here is to realize that there are many ways in which the issue is misframed or misnamed. And one of the ways in which it is misframed is that it is considered a matter of live and let live. Why won't we let the Haredi do their thing and organize themselves in space, men vis-a-vis women as they want? Whereas this is not at all the issue. You and I had an earlier conversation and we talked about the seminal article by two prominent, important philosophers, Avishai Margalit and Moshe Halbertal. And the way they, address the problem of multiculturalism in their important article, talked about how important it is to enable ultra-Orthodox, as one of their examples, to maintain their right to culture, even if this means that the general world around them should make some concessions. Now, the examples that they gave are women that come to visit an ultra-Orthodox neighborhood in Jerusalem or in Bnei Brak, another Haredi city, should dress modestly. That was a form of concession. This article was written almost 3 decades ago. When you look at the concessions that Israeli women are expected to make now, I have no doubt, even though I didn't get a chance to ask Halbertal and Margalit how they think, and I think it would be cool if they wrote a kind of updates on their article, the multiculturalism redux or something these days, that I have no doubt that when they thought of concessions, they did not think that a Knesset member should be, a female Knesset member should be moved from her seat at the request of a Haredi member who doesn't want to sit next to a woman, or of academic university professor who is discriminated in her employment opportunity because she is not allowed to enter a male classroom. So these are or to give you a finally shocking but real example, a COVID patient who was not evacuated, the ambulance that came to take her to the hospital did not board her on the ambulance because the other COVID patient in the ambulance said, she is not dressed modestly and I won't have her in the ambulance. Okay, so these are the kind of externalities that Israeli women are expected to pay, which I'm sure transgresses the imagination of the 1993 Margalit and Halbertal's account of multiculturalism.
Yofi, listening to you to describe the drivers of this new, what you see as this new phenomenon, and kind of the motivations, both from the government side and from the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi community in Israel. One of the things that jumps out at me, I wonder what you think of this, is kind of that first article was really a seminal piece, I would say, in syllabi about multiculturalism. I think when I teach the class, it's one of the first things I have students read. How focused the authors were on the right to culture internally, for those communities, and kind of how, given that right, that value, how should Israeli society, or how is Israeli society navigating that? One of the things that you're introducing in your description is how now it's not even about quite as much the right to culture and what Israeli society might owe and might not owe religious minorities, but these are government initiatives because of the government's interests, things that the government is trying to accomplish, right? For all we know, certain communities might be fine being, as you say, left alone, walls high, and government initiatives in order to change the facts on the ground when it comes to economics, or these ethical imperatives that have been front and center, as you described, in Israeli politics, like. No, we don't like that model anymore of different communities being left well enough alone. This is something very new. Now it's the government pushing for increasing forms of integration. Do you think that's part of kind of why we're seeing, trying to get at the government's dilemma, the government's willingness to expand the areas in which it's willing to provide accommodation, because it's not for the people it's talking about, it's for themselves. We have these needs that we need accomplished. What do you think about that framing of things?
So I guess it raises an age-old question that, libraries upon libraries are written on both in law and in political science, which is the good old divide between public and private. Many of the activities that we're talking about take place in the private sphere. So when we're talking about public sphere, when we're talking about publicly funded and regulated colleges and universities, for example, or about professional training courses organized by the Civil Service Commissioner that are done in segregation. One course for men, one course for women, for people who are planned, to go and join the civil service. These are undoubtedly kind of perceived as or at least were perceived in the beginning. There's also a deterioration there in the discourse. They were perceived as temporary but necessary concessions that the government must do in order to achieve a goal. We're kind of going to, to use an Israeli metaphor that I'm not sure works in English, but close our nose, this is not very, the order is not very pleasant, but still we're going to tolerate this kind of infringement on equality and on how our public sphere is being run normally, in order to give like a jump start, for the Haredi to integrate, and by the way, integrate but not become secular, not in the government's perspective and nor in mine. Some people say, oh, you want, the Haredim to become like you. No, we're talking about Haredim staying Haredim, but about every space, every office, every classroom being able to accommodate them alongside others. That's kind of my vision. So in these kind of early painting of the government's plan, that was the deal. We're going to tolerate a kind of unpleasant reality. Today, a short 10 years later, we are hearing different music. And the music is, this is not just a temporary and necessary means to kind of push Haredim to work and to study and to consume, but there is something intrinsically rightful. There is the right to culture. We cannot expect them to change, and we don't want them to change. And if that means that the kind of bubble of sensitivity that they paint around them, kind of when we think of the harm principle, harm begins before we touch one's body or one's freedom of speech. Harm begins by the fact that we're seeing women as teaching us in the classroom. That's a harm. If I'm a ultra-Orthodox person, then what my ear hears these days is that rather than kind of women receiving, in the old days, women received apologies. Look, we're sorry that you need to get off the stage, but we really want to have everybody able to see this public ceremony. Today, women are the predators by the fact that you insist on your presence as a woman. You are infringing on ultra-Orthodox rights. So that's kind of a side point on how the discourse is rapidly changing. And for me, it's kind of upside down. Another way in which it's changing is that if my argument and the line that I kind of lead is, look, this is an issue of equality, and it's an issue of basic liberties. Having the Rabin Square, the central square in Tel Aviv, with an event of Chabad, where there is a divide and women must be on one side and men on the other side, is something that the public square cannot tolerate. The upside downness move is this is substantive equality. So the non-egalitarian position is my position that resists segregation. And B, the true liberal position, the true freedom advancing position is the one that fights on the freedom of the Haredim to have the segregated spaces. The illiberal standpoint is allegedly my standpoint that, resists segregation. But I want to go back to the beginning of my answer. I said that we were talking about public and private. There are areas where the lines blur and we need to kind of phrase and rephrase where we draw the line. So for example, a few years back, a new Haredi radio station, a Sephardic ultra-Orthodox radio station, begins its broadcasting. It receives a license and a wavelength from the Public Radio Authority. And in order to build its audience, it brands itself as an ultra-pious, ultra-modest station that does not broadcast women's voices. Not women singing, women voices speaking at all. There are no women heard in the station. Is this a public sphere or is this a private sphere? Is this a community area where we should respect the community's preference not to hear women, even though it's like most other issues, there is no basis in halacha for this. This is kind of in the hello of halacha, hidur mitzvah. So in a very innovative class action, I think it's innovative worldwide, a civil court in Israel said this is unjust discrimination and the station should compensate for discriminating its female audience. Then we move to, to other questions. Do we do something about a Haredi online newspaper that airbrushes, sometimes completely airbrushes out and sometimes just blurs the faces of female Israeli politicians? If you are a politician, all you have as your asset is your presence, your recognition. People need to know who you are, right? In order to be able to say, oh, I like her, I'm going to vote for her or not. Is that not part of kind of some sort of right that we need to articulate anew here about the boundaries of a public venue? Yes, it's a community online newspaper, it's a Haredi newspaper, but it provides a service that is essentially public, and it completely erases not just politicians, by the way, even Holocaust survivors, just out of the camps, with their waif, heartbreaking bodies are airbrushed if they're female. You see a photo of a house after a fire, and there is a shoe there, a female heel shoe. It's airbrushed because any association with the female body, is taboo.
Yofi, do you mind if I'm trying to getting a sense a little bit of the argument over here. It sounds like, or at least so far, I take you to be arguing that when it comes to purely private areas of communal life, I think you might say, well, there, whatever the norms are the norms, and kind of communities operate in that way. And when things move into the public, at that point, either democratic norms or egalitarian norms or quasi-constitutional norms, whatever it might be, ought to operate. And then kind of you have the secondary argument about, where should we draw the line? As you know, this is a very hard thing between public and private. Could you give us a sense of like some things that you view as purely private? What is purely private? Because it's interesting to me to hear you say that like this private newspaper, which I assume doesn't receive government funding, although it might. I mean, who knows? Maybe it does receive. That you see as public. So what qualifies as purely private?
The things that the Israeli law designates as things that we want interfere in, as matter of sex equality are, I think, pretty similar to what American law would say. So obviously, family events, weddings, even though there is a growing extreme practices in Haredi weddings, as a side note, it used to be that after the dinner, there was a divide for the dancing. Today, the divide begins from the staircases. So women and men are much more kind of extremely divided. So family gatherings, synagogue, of course, anything that has to do with the core religious practice is protected. Schools, elementary school and high school in Israel are, and we can talk about whether this is legitimate in itself, but legally as a matter of positive law, there is a communal autonomy, parental autonomy for parents to send their kids to elementary and secondary school, high school that are segregated. I want to also kind of parenthetically note that there has been a extremization of this reality, not only in the Haredi community, but also in the Orthodox, the religious community in Israel, where 20 years ago, you started to separate the boys and the girls at the age of 15, at the age of 14. Today, most religious children go to school from the first grade in segregation, and there is this kind of a ripple effect of influence between the ultra-Orthodox community and the religious community. Another area which...
Do you mind if I ask you a question on that school stuff? That was super interesting. Had you asked me before we talked, had you said to me, listen, Michael, here's what I want you to do. I'm going to give you give you a list of stuff. I want you to label public, private, like play a matching game. I would have thought, I'm thinking certainly about American constitutional law, I guess a bit. I would have thought schools, public, online private newspapers, private. And you made this move, which I think is super interesting. I'm curious why. Like you flipped it for us. You said, no, segregation, at least as a matter of positive law, it sounds like you have a little bit of a critique that you have over there that you might want to get at. But, there you see maybe parental autonomy, communal autonomy to have segregation, which might have, who knows what the consequences that might be. There you seem to have a little more, you see sex segregation norms as playing a more valid role than for the private online newspaper. Do you mind saying something about that?
Thank you. This is actually really interesting for me as well. So thanks for this question. I guess if you asked me, is this good in an ideal world to have boys and girls study separately from first grade to 12th grade, my answer would be no. And I know I'm going against a lot of unfounded axioms that, it's good for the girls because they're better in math, etc. Actually, if you look at the studies, the jury is still very much out. They're very inconclusive that it's helpful for the girls, but we won't get into that now. But what I'm saying is that I can understand the notion of parental autonomy, just like as I won't tell a parent, hey, you can't raise your kid as a complete vegan or eating raw food or, limiting screen time to 0. We won't say that unless there is a real violation of the child's good, where the welfare authorities should interfere. I think it's a reason for a lot of the boys and girls don't get a chance to see each other as human beings and respect and interact and explore, etc. But I accept that as part of the deal in the Israeli society, okay? Now, what happens after that when you go to the military, after you're 18, or when you go to the university or to the workplace, there it is pretty clear to me. It's not that clear to policymakers, but it's pretty clear to me that we cannot hope to have a democratic society that maintains gender equality if we introduce in those spaces sex segregation, which again, as a big footnote, and I hope we get to talk about it in a few minutes, is in fact mistitled. It's not separate but equal what we're talking about. Most of those segregated spaces are in fact extremely discriminatory and asymmetrical. So women get much less. But to go back to your question, it's not that I think that the private newspaper is not private, but in Israeli law, even private newspapers that are privately owned and are recognized as a public service. We had cases, for example, with the newspaper Macroeconomics, which serves the religious community, that refused to post an ad for a hotline that supports youth exploring whether they're LGBT, so exploring their sexuality. The paper said this is not appropriate for our audience. And the Israeli court said, sorry, this is part of your public service. You can't discriminate on the basis of sexuality. Now, for me, showing the picture of the new government, and we finally have a government, after 2 years where we weren't so successful in starting one, showing this picture and airbrushing the female ministers from this picture is a form of discrimination, of sex discrimination that should be legally addressed. But let me throw in another example that challenges the question of, is it communal or is it public? So the two Haredi parties in Israel, Agudat Israel, Yadut Torah, and which is the Ashkenazi party, and Shas, the Mizrahi party, the Sephardic party, by principle, overtly declare that they would not allow women to be members in their parties. There has been 2 petitions to the High Court of Justice, one by a secular lawyer in the name of the Ashkenazi Haredi women who later joined to support this petition. The Haredi community has an ambivalent relationship with the state courts, but they did support at some point. And another by a Sephardic Haredi woman against Shas, saying to the court, this is unconstitutional. How can a party, enjoy the benefits of the political game while being essentially racist against women? And the court, without getting into too many technicalities, kind of rolled the issue away as a hot potato, kind of watered it down without writing a substantive decision. And I think the reason is, apart from the question of, is it bold enough, and all the critique that it's get, the attacks that it's exposed to in Israel, I think the real issue there for many of the justices was yes, it's a public party in the Knesset, but do we interfere with a communal preference such as this one? It's very sensitive. How can we kind of force the ultra-Orthodox to have women Knesset members or ministers? So I managed to convince you how difficult the line is, I hope, between the
Oh, no.
public.
That doesn't require, I don't think that requires much. Public and private, these, I think you right out of the gate identified how thorny that kind of issue can be. I guess here's what I'm wondering. So tell me where you think either both the legislature or courts, where are they falling down? Where are they doing a bad job here? Kind of how would you change the way Israeli law, both legislation and judicial opinion, are dealing with let's start with that question, are dealing with these issues, and then I have a follow-up on that.
Okay, so the law on the books, I think is pretty good. We're pretty equipped. If we only applied it, we're pretty equipped in dealing with those questions. We have a good, it's not enumerated explicitly, but we have a good and strong right to equality. And in terms of gender equality, I think we may be doing better than the US Supreme Court. Thankfully, we don't have the tier system of review of strict scrutiny and intermediate scrutiny, etc. And if anything, gender and sex equality receive a higher kind of standard of review in Israel than other issues like discrimination of Arabs, etc. So we have a good constitutional right to equality, which is part of the right to dignity. And we also have a very strong and detailed civil law that creates a tort to any service provider that discriminates on the basis of sex, race, religion, sexuality, age, etc. So the laws are there. The courts have been pretty good at intervening when those practices that concern this, this clash between religion and sex equality, when those practices either leave women completely out, so exclude them from an activity. The court said this is a no-no, and the radio station example demonstrates that. Or it interfered when the segregation was blatantly unequal. So if we say, yes, women are welcome to the activity, but they get less space, less budget, less prestige, then the court said this is a no-no. Where is the court too ambivalent in my mind? When it comes to questions that are framed as, oh, this is a matter of separate but equal. Now, when we say separate but equal, the first thing that comes to our mind is, of course, Brown v. Board of Education. And there are good reasons to refuse this easy analogy, this quick analogy. Race is not like sex, or sex is not like race. With race, we think that the difference is constructed. It's not a real difference, but sex differences, even though I'm a feminist, I think they are grounded in some real physical traits. Then there is a question of humiliation. We practice sex segregation all the time. Now we have just and rightful challenges, in my mind, by transgender and other gender fluid people that say, hey, this dichotomy, when you send me to either male bathroom or a female bathroom, you put me under a real harm to classify myself where I don't fully belong to either of those classifications, and I'm subject to a lot of hostility and intolerance. Those issues are related to one another, but we're gonna, and you can ask me about that later. I'll be happy to talk about it. But to go back to the question of segregation in terms of its clash with religion, religion is very essentialist. It divides people to, you know, females and males. It's very hostile and intolerant to anybody who does any form of gender bending, not just transgender, but also men with long hair, you know, are hard to classify, and they can confuse the easy sending you to one side of the room. And going back to the issue of is it like brown? Is it like separate but equal? Another difference is that when we think of brown, we think of forced segregation, and when we think of sex segregation in our context, it's often framed as voluntary. You know, religious women don't live in some false consciousness. They see it, and I know they do, and I expect it and accept it and respect it. They might be, you know, having struggles as Jewish feminists, religious feminists do these days, about the height of the divide in the synagogue, but they accept the divide. They might have questions about how to practice going to the mikveh, and whether, you know, you can touch your wife when she gives labor, is she impure when she gives labor, etc., etc. Kind of bend the rules from within what halacha permits, but they still feel that purity rules mean something deep for them as part of their practice. So, so what I'm saying is that, yes, it's not an easy analogy between brown and sex segregation, but in effect, in my mind, the impact of pointing, reminding us all the time our sex difference undermines any hope for equality. Because if you think about it, I'm sorry, I'll finish with my long answer in a second. If you think about it, we can pretty much describe the achievements of enlightenment and of the, you know, the big constitutional revolutions as saying persons do not determine their fate by their body. You know, whether you're a woman or a man, or your skin color shouldn't be the determining factor of what you can be. And when you say to people in contexts that are irrelevant for the activity in question, before you're a student, you're a woman. Before you're a professor, you're a man, first and foremost. You reinforce essentialist views such that they undermine the ability of people to flourish, to be autonomous, to write their life story.
You know, as I'm listening to you discuss, you know, the similarities and differences between questions of discrimination and segregation, both the U.S. and Israeli context, one of the features here of the dilemma you're describing, and I want to use kind of build off of some of the questions we're getting in the Q&A. One of the features really is like the way in which the Israeli government sounds like, from your description, they're put in this position if they are to integrate ultra-Orthodox and potentially other minority faith communities into Israeli society. And there are reasons, both it sounded like ethical and economic reasons why that's important. Integration requires almost, or at least the pitch is that integration requires some degree of segregation. And you know, I'm looking at one of the questions in the Q&A. So here we have from one of the participants. In your opinion, in what way is the non-Haredi population in Israel, both secular and non-Jewish citizens, affected by this legal and cultural change? I guess my question to you is, you know, thinking about that kind of question, What would happen if, what do you think would happen if Israeli society, the government, adopted a perspective more like your own? Do you think it could still accomplish this integration, or are we at a place now where, this is the choice? The choice is that if we, for all the ethical and economic reasons, if the government is pursuing integration, then it's going to have these kinds of what I think you describe as philosophical and political concessions, or can we have our cake and eat it too, kind of in the Yofi Tirosh view of the world?
So when I started talking about this about 10 years ago, people told me, oh, you're scaring us off with slippery slope arguments, and slippery slope arguments are slippery slope in themselves. But today I have a much easier task because going back to the question from the participant, we do see the immense effects on secular Israeli women that this kind of normalization of segregation has, and of modesty requirements. So just to give, I mentioned some examples, the ambulance example, the Knesset member example. Shockingly, about a month ago, the Minister of Communication in Israel met with rabbis. It was on the question of kosher phones. It begged the minister to stop a reform that would stop the rabbis from being able to recognize by the number whether an ultra-Orthodox person has a kosher phone or a smartphone. Kosher phones have different numbers with different 3 digits, and the reform would have, stopped that. And they begged him. They said, our public is not strong enough halachically. They don't have enough faith. We need to have this kind of ostracization sanction on them, which, again, as a footnote, it makes you think of paternalism, the sensitivity to paternalism from people like me. They say to me, oh, you're not respecting the wills of the ultra-Orthodox women, but the rabbis can be as paternalistic as they choose. But in this meeting, it seems like, and there were very faint denials and pictures to prove otherwise, that the rabbis asked the minister to clear the room from all the professional women there, including the CEO of the Ministry of Communication. So they left the room. So it was an all-male room in Israel, which we think of as a democratic society, with the pioneers and the female, women in combat roles and the Nobel Prize winners, etc. Those Israeli women were opinionated and were everywhere. Just imagine that for a second, Michael. Internalize the image that you're a professional woman, you run a governmental ministry, and you are asked to leave the room, even if your expertise and your opinion and your experience matters and relevant in this meeting, because you are a woman, okay? I can give you another 10 examples which we don't have time for. Now, as to your question, my answer, what would happen in the Yofi Tirosh way? My answer is twofold. I think as a practical answer, things will be pretty much the same. I think the changes in the Haredi society are such that even without sex-segregated campuses, they would have pursued higher education. I hear a lot, without from women, without segregated classrooms, I wouldn't have attended academic studies. And I respect this answer and I respect this experience, but there is a long line of precedent that shows that when the government did not concede, take the radio example, okay? What happened after the ruling was issued? Do you think the radio stations shut down because it had to pay so much money? Do you think they said, Gewalt, the right of religion, the Israeli government or the court are ruining our community? No. They started introducing women broadcasters and women interviewees into the radio station. The sky did not fall. So I think that the trends that we're seeing within the Haredi society would have continued, maybe a little slower, but the bottom line is if the ultimate goal is for integration in the sense that Haredi people can work or study or function in the general society, what that means is that they need to bring into account, to take into account that women are there in the Israeli society. And a part of being in the general culture outside of the fence is to interact with women. Now, I think it's a really Jewish thing. I think there is a big, kind of overstating the bans on religious men. And there are actually some pretty prominent Orthodox and some ultra-Orthodox rabbis that say that, why are you so worried about bus segregation? The contact that is incidental between men and women is okay. It's not, it's only, touch that is intended as sexual touch, which is the problem. So to answer your question, first, I think changes would have happened the same. What we see now is that there is no actual choice for Haredi men and women to attend co-ed universities, for example, because once you have the segregated option, the community pressure to attend them is immense. If you don't go there, you will be labeled as not, strict enough, not pious enough. But the other answer that I have is, it may be provocative and annoy some of our audience and maybe even you. But the answer is that and it's not the case, but if the option is between integrating Haredi people at the expense of women not being able to function as free, dignified members of Israeli society, or, kind of continue advancing Israeli women's equality. And there's a lot to do there, just like there's a lot to do in other, democratic, developed world countries. Then yes, the Haredi people that are not willing to interact with women, and we're not talking about immodest, things that are counter to halacha. We're not talking about interacting with women without their shirt on or with some forced immodest touch. We're talking about sitting in the same office or sitting in the same classroom. These are the challenges. If those challenges are conceived as unfathomable for Haredim, then yes, we should give up on this project of integration, because there won't be an Israeli society, there won't be democracy if we go along this way.
So those were two amazingly, I hope everyone who is at home listening, those are two amazingly bold statements. I supremely interesting. First one, Yofi, yeah, just in terms of listening to it, sounds like part of you is willing to roll the dice, kind of like somebody shows up to the poker table, right? You think it's a bluff. You think really, if you take away some of these options, integration is going to happen anyway. It's a false choice. And I thought that was really interesting. I guess some people might view that as risky for the hardcore integrationists, but your second answer kind of solves that problem. You like the old school world a little bit more if these are really the stakes where we go back to the old school phones and the walls are up, and at a minimum the walls, it's not just that in your view that they protected Haredi society, ultra-Orthodox society, they protected Israeli society in some way, which I think is I think it's an extremely provocative take on some of these issues.
I don't see myself as that bold in those 2 points, but I'll give you one reference to each of them quickly. One is my esteemed colleague, Professor Barak Medina, was the provost of Hebrew U these days, and an expert in constitutional law, received a letter from Haredi women saying, please allow us to study law in your prestigious institution. And he replied to them, and in segregation for women only. And he replied to them, listen, even if I had the most evidence that opening Hebrew University in Shabbat would be extremely beneficial, draw many students that can study during the weekdays, promote the economy, whatever you want as benefits, I would not do it, because equality is the Shabbat of democracy, okay? So just as Shabbat is a taboo, so I cannot compromise on equality. And to my first answer, between you and I, it's not me that says that it's a bluff. I have many Haredi friends that tell me it's a bluff, once we draw a line, then and stand our grounds, then the Haredim will abide by this line. And I can also give you an example that will interest you, especially, Michael. Ben Gurion University in the Negev, where I grew up, wanted to encourage Bedouin students to join it. And the leader said, great, but you need to provide our girls separate classrooms. They won't feel comfortable in regular classrooms. Their parents and their religious leaders won't allow it. And this was like 2 decades ago. Ben Gurion University said they're very welcome, but gender segregation will not be a part of the deal. And what you see today in Ben Gurion and where I was dean in Sapir College, in Sderot, and in many other places, is an incredible prosperity of Bedouin women pursuing academic degrees. We have professors, we have doctors, physicians, etc. And the reasons, the grounds for the request for segregation were extremely similar to those of the Haredim. So I think it's a really illuminating parallel example that can teach us what would happen if we take an alternative path.
So we've got a couple more questions from on the Q&A. Here's one. It's somebody from Israel, so that means they're up very late, so they should go to the front of the line.
Thank you for attending, Israelis.
Okay, here we go. So you have been claiming for years, and prove it, that gender segregation is a slippery slope that produces more extremism, and another segregation in which women will always be inferior. Do you think that the government and the authorities in Israel are unable to understand that this is really the case, or that they simply do not have the will and ability to deal with the social political bomb? Thank you.
Good question. I think it's a little bit of both. I think a lot of my liberal colleagues really don't get it. They don't get what it means to be told, wait, there is an important national goal and interest to promote. So yes, we'll get to your equality, but it will take some time. Just, sit aside for a few more years with your gender equality concerns until we integrate the Haredim. But I also think that what was the second option, Michael? Can you repeat it?
No problem. No problem. The second option is they simply do not have the will and ability to deal with the social political bond.
I think that they are reading the public, and the Israeli public, unfortunately, in many other areas has had it with concessions that it needs to make in terms of religion and state. We have reforms these days about regulation of kosher food that our new Minister of Religion is leading, about conversion to Judaism, about the rabbinical courts and many other transportation in Shabbat is a big revolution that is happening in the municipal level. And I think the Israeli public is saying to itself, okay, we won't give up on any of those other areas that matter to us, but on the women thing, we can let it slip. We can let it go. And the reason that they are thinking that is that they think that it won't come to their back door. That it's they're misconceiving the issue as a matter of what happens in Bnei Brak stays in Bnei Brak. And they don't get that if their 12-year-old girl is playing in a basketball team these days, and she's in a tournament in a co-ed group, her coach has to put her on the bench and then have her not playing the game if her group is playing against an all-boys religious group. These are the rules of the national tournament for basketball in Israel. So the way that they are failing to imagine the future of their daughters and their sisters and their wives or themselves when it comes to women. I ask women, what are the most urgent things in Israel for women? And many of my colleagues and friends don't recognize sex segregation as one of the threats or the major threats. And I think they have a blind spot there. We have a lot of homework.
Well, Yofi, thanks so much for hanging out with me a little bit. I'm gonna pass the proverbial mic back to Ken to take us
Thank
on.
you, Michael. This was so much fun. Thanks a lot.
You two are fantastic. Thank you so much, Yofi and Michael, for such an engaging discussion. Thank you to our audience for joining us today. Before we close, I want to flag our upcoming February-March events. And I'm hoping that someone can put the link into the chat so that people can open that before we end the meeting. On Wednesday, February 16th, we're hosting virtually a half-day symposium on controversial issues in citizenship education, focused on insights from Israel. It's hosted jointly with the law school and with the School of Education. CLE credit will be available, and we have an impressive panel of scholars. On Tuesday, February 22nd, we're holding our annual Robbins Collection lecture in Jewish Law and Thought with Professor Amanda Bekenstein-Mbuvi, the academic leader of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. And her talk is entitled Reimagining Diversity and Jewish Belonging, A Journey Through Genesis. Finally, look out for session 4 of this series. 1 month from today, Bar-Ilan Professor Elisheva Rossman-Stolman will be joined by my Berkeley colleague, Professor Ronit Stahl, to discuss gender, religion, and the military in Israel. Thank you all again. Michael, Yofi, thanks so much, and we look forward to seeing you soon.